Hi again then guys, and welcome to another look back at some of the coolest cars to be featured in the Forza franchise, but in particular ones which are no longer featured. Now, with many of the cars in Forza 2 or Forza 3 or Horizon that we discuss, you can kind of understand why they're not around anymore. They may have not been overly popular, overly successful, or particularly good in some cases, but you can kind of understand why they're not around anymore, as much as we would like them to be. For me personally, for instance, the Seat Cupra GT from Forza 2 is one of my absolute favourites that is no longer featured, and wasn't featured ever again after that game, but at the same time, I can kind of understand why it's not featured. It wasn't a hugely popular car back then, but those of us who did love it really, really loved it. With this car, it's actually the exact opposite, because this isn't some obscure cult classic which only a handful of players enjoyed. This was a hugely popular car. On every Forza game that features it, this car is an absolute monster, but it's never been featured again after Forza 4. And that makes no sense to me, because with some, you can understand maybe the manufacturer isn't around anymore. TVR, for instance, that's why they're not in the game, or maybe they remove the manufacturer completely, such as Panos, which is still disappointing, but at least if the manufacturer's gone as a whole, you can understand, of course, why the car wouldn't be there. But in the case of Koenigsegg, they're not gone. They've always been a part of the franchise in literally every single Forza game. So why would they not be featured anymore? Or at least specifically this one. Now, over the years, they have phased out some of the older models, such as the CC8S and the CCX, which is understandable, disappointing, but understandable. With this one, though, it does surprise me, because this car was so popular. It really was up there with the FXX and the Zonda R, which of course have been featured, and are still featured in the franchise, so not having this one is really strange. Now, Koenigsegg is still in the game. We still have the Agera, the 1-to-1, the Regera, so they still have a strong presence on both the Motorsport and Horizon games. So why not have this car? It's still the only true racing Koenigsegg ever. It's kind of important, so it's a weird car not to include. Now, in terms of what you actually get from the car, for those who maybe haven't played the older games, you really are in for a treat if you go back and use this vehicle, because although it definitely isn't a beginner-friendly car, I mean, would you expect it to be? It's a Koenigsegg race car, of course it's not going to be easy to drive, but it's got a 5-litre engine, 630 horsepower, which doesn't sound that great in comparison to the 806 horsepower, 940 horsepower, 1300 horsepower that you typically expect from other Koenigsegg's, but of course not. It's a restricted model for racing, so it's understandable that it has less power, because just like the TVR Speed 12 race car and various others, it quite simply has to. Now, the torque is still very high, 553 pound-feet, which is really good. Most race cars tend to drop a little bit in that regard. They go more for power than torque, especially high-revving, low-capacity V8s from teams like Ferrari, for instance, or the V10s from Lambo. This one, though, of course, it's going to have a lot of torque. Koenigsegg's are known for having huge power, huge torque, and huge straight-line performance. And that is the one thing which is definitely carried over with the CCGT, because on every Forza game that features it, this thing is insanely fast for the category and type of race car which it is. Now, in its base form, base of course being very relative, it's an R2 category vehicle, 857 PI, which is quite high, but very, very well placed and understandably placed, again up against stuff like the FXX and the Zonda R, which is exactly where it should be. And the horsepower per tonne doesn't sound amazing, it's 573, but in a car that doesn't have a ridiculous amount of power anyway, 630 is a good amount. That's a supercar level, but that's a lot lower than you'd usually have from a Koenigsegg. But of course, it's lighter. It only weighs 1100 kilos, making it a lot lighter than many of the other race cars in that kind of class. Not all of them, but many of them. Now, when you tune up this car, you're looking at well over 800 horsepower. The top speed can go easily over 250 with, of course, low downforce, and so it naturally has the exact advantages which you would expect a Koenigsegg race car to have. Now, in real life, of course, Koenigsegg didn't race this car, which is unfortunate, because if they had have gone forward with this, it could have been a pretty cool car to watch, or in a similar way to teams like Panos or TVR with the Speed 12, it may not have won anything, but it would have been a crowd pleaser for sure. Just like when you see a Pagani Zonda race car show up, the Zonda R or the Zonda GR. They're crowd pleasers. Well, not the Zonda R, because you're not going to see that in a race, but you know what I mean. They're the kind of cars that people like to support, even if the chances of them winning are slim. That would have been the case with the Koenigsegg, because as monstrous as it is in a straight line, let's be honest, Koenigsegg's aren't great around corners. They're kind of notorious for that. And in fact, when Evo magazine did a supercar rundown around the Nordschleife, the Koenigsegg crashed. So it doesn't exactly help with the image that they have. But at the same time, just like many other supercars that are notoriously difficult, or at least challenging to drive, like the Speed 12, or the SSC Ultimate Aero, or the Hennessy Venom, they are very, very rewarding. And in particular with the Koenigsegg, this was a hugely popular car on tracks such as the Le Mans, especially without the chicanes, but even with them, for understandable reasons, because what a car like this does so well, at least in a game, in fact more so in a game than in real life, because regulations aren't as strict and you can power up the car for instance, is very similar to what I do when I tune up a muscle car. Because when I tune up a muscle car, and I've talked about this before on the channel, you don't need to improve what the car is already good at. A muscle car already has a lot of power and a lot of torque. What you need to work on, and this applies to any car, but muscle cars are a good example, is what the car isn't good at. So as long as you take care of stuff like suspension, brakes, handling in general, grip, then the speed and the power and the torque will literally take care of itself. And that is exactly what this Koenigsegg really epitomizes, because it has the sheer raw straight line speed that you would expect from a Koenigsegg, and Koenigsegg didn't try to make it even faster in a straight line. They tried to work on what Koenigsegg road cars don't have, which is massive grip through corners, through stuff like huge wings, diffusers, flat floors, all that kind of stuff. Of course, racing tyres. That goes without saying. But the result is you get a car which is still definitely not the leader of the pack when it comes to handling, but the difference is the handling is good enough to allow the Koenigsegg to not lose as much time through corners, which then in turn allows it to use that monstrous straight line speed on every single straight section. So in a similar way to the Benetton B186 Formula 1 car, which is the most powerful Formula car ever built, that car was not as good as the others on the grid through corners. But with 1400 horsepower in a straight line, at least in qualifying form, nothing could keep up. This is like that. Through corners, the Zonda R or the FXX can beat it, but as soon as you get on a straight, that mid-range and especially top-end power that Koenigsegg's are known for really takes over. Not difficult at all to see why it was such a popular car, and it begs the question of why it isn't featured anymore. A very strange choice, and if it was brought back, I know the community as a whole would be very happy about that. But that's it for this pick overall. Definitely worth going back to use this car. And yeah, that's it for this pick overall. So of course I'll see you guys next time. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.